Singapore was very nearly on the 2023 Supercars schedule. That's right, Supercars were almost a support category for Formula 1 at the famous night race. And while a deal wasn't struck for this season, it sounds highly likely Supercars will be pushing to get on that support bill in the coming years. So today, I want to talk about the potential pros and cons of Supercars going to Singapore, and also discuss why I personally think it will solve a mistake Supercars have been making for almost 2 decades. Let's jump into it. I think for a lot of fans, their first thoughts on whether Supercars should go to Singapore is largely going to depend on whether they feel Supercars should even be looking internationally in the first place, or just focus on making the series an Australian and New Zealand calendar. As for my thoughts, I'm not against Supercars having 1 or 2 international events as long as they don't come at the cost of an Australian or New Zealand round. For me, I'd love to see Supercars visit every single Australian state every year, maybe taking the ACT out of that equation, and of course at least 1 round in New Zealand. But once those boxes are checked, I would love to see Supercars chase something like an event in Singapore. So let's explore some of the reasons why it could work, and the first one I think is timing. We've got the introduction of Gen 3 happening this year, and I think there's a lot of excitement for that here in Australia, and it's essentially a new product, so it seems like the perfect opportunity to reintroduce Supercars to a global audience. I think anyone that wasn't sold on it before would at least be willing to give it a shot with the new rules. Gen 3 also solves another problem Supercars has always had when it's raced overseas. The Ford brand is recognized all over the world, but of course up until now they've also been running Holdens in Supercars, which is a very Australian brand, and there's always been this awkward discussion about whether the Holden should be rebadged as Chevs. Obviously there's that GM connection there, just to make it more appropriate for an international audience. From this year onwards, that's no longer a concern, because whether Supercars are racing here in Australia or overseas, it is going to be the Chevy badge represented on the grid. Supercars in Singapore also works well from the perspective of the organisers, in my opinion, because there's a lot of competition between the different Grand Prix venues right now. They're all competing for a spot on the calendar. They're all trying to show themselves as unique and somewhat irreplaceable. And Singapore used to have that unique element in the fact it was a night race, but there's a lot of Formula 1 rounds that are now held at night. So perhaps Singapore bolstering its support category lineup is one of those things they could do to try and make their event stand out once again. I understand Singapore was still a sellout last year, so they're not exactly struggling for fan attendance, but I know for myself, one of the reasons I personally haven't gone to the Grand Prix in Singapore is the fact the support category lineup is so weak. For me, it's just such better value for money from a racing perspective to go somewhere like Melbourne where there's all these other categories, rather than Singapore where there's Formula 1 and usually 1 or 2 smaller support series. Looking at things from Supercars perspective again though, I think they could really do with a round in Singapore, because they could tap into a lot of existing support they have in the Formula 1 paddock. I know obviously Zach Brown is a part owner of the Walkinshaw Andretti United team. Andretti, I just dropped the name there, they could potentially be on the Formula 1 grid, so there's another connection. And I know for a fact Crofty is a huge fan of Supercars, and all of the drivers in Formula 1 always speak highly of Supercars when they see them in Melbourne. So I think if Supercars could tap into that excitement and perhaps do some cross promotion, that enthusiasm that already exists in the F1 world could perhaps extend to potential new fans of Supercars. Finally, let's talk risk. I think this is one of the reasons why Singapore makes sense from a business perspective for Supercars. Unlike previous international events like China or Bahrain, where they'd have to largely market the event themselves and try and get fans through the door, well, that's largely taken care of by the Singapore Grand Prix organisers. So without oversimplifying it, Supercars basically just have to show up to the party and they can test the waters in a very safe way. That does bring us to the arguments against Supercars going to Singapore though. I just highlighted Singapore as one of the lower risk options, but the simple fact is Supercars would still be taking on a whole lot of freight cost, which is very high and unpredictable right now, and is apparently the leading reason why Singapore didn't get on the calendar for 2023. Even if transportation costs do come down over the next few years, there's still a few other things Supercars will have to consider with a round in Singapore, and one of those is how they position the sport. When they go to Singapore, they're not going to be the headline act. They are going to be playing second fiddle to Formula 1, and I'm sure there's going to be some business consideration on if that's the way they want to present the Supercar sport to the rest of the world. For me, I don't think this should be a barrier for supercars. The simple fact is, on an international level, no motorsport is anywhere near as popular as Formula 1 in most parts of the world. So supercars, I think, should just accept that fact, embrace that fact, try and tap into the popularity of Formula 1. And of course, it is a completely different category, and I think most fans will respect that. There are a few other arguments against supercars in Singapore, one of which is sponsors. There's some brands out there like Red Bull and Shell that supercars could pretty much race anywhere in the world and they would be getting value for money on their sponsorship because they are just about everywhere. But then there's some cars sponsored by, you know, lesser known, smaller Australian brands, which is fantastic, but you got to question if they'll get as much value out of supercars racing overseas. And then finally, could F1 itself be a barrier to supercars at Singapore? While the Grand Prix organisers seem keen, F1 has a big sustainability push right now. A lot of their events are claiming to be targeting, you know, carbon neutrality, and if Singapore wants to follow suit, shipping all those supercars over to Singapore is going to make that a lot more of a challenge for them. But I think if this was a factor, the conversations would have been shut down a long time ago, so hopefully it isn't going to be a barrier. I always like to explore the positives and the negatives of anything in supercars, but overall I actually feel really positive about supercars potentially going to Singapore. It's been a pipe dream of mine for quite some time, and I see a lot of reasons why it will work. I think the only thing that overhangs the whole potential event for me is just making sure supercars are ready to capture potential international interest. I see a lot of comments on supercars' socials from people in Europe and America, for example, who say they love the sport, but they just find it so hard to follow because it is hard to get on TV in those countries. I think if supercars is going to put this new Gen 3 product out to the world, they need to make sure people can actually follow it beyond a potential Singapore round. I also think a dedicated supercars video game would really help in that area, making the sport accessible at all times to an international audience, but that is a topic for another video. At the top of the video, I teased that Singapore could potentially solve a mistake supercars has been making for 2 decades now, so let's finish on that point. And the mistake I think supercars has made for so long when they've taken the category international is putting them on the wrong tracks. For me at least, the thing that makes supercars exciting is the fact they are imperfect machines. They slide around, they bang up against walls, they can take a hit, they can fly over curbs. So when you have all that capability of these machines and you take them to places like supercars has gone in the past, like Bahrain, like Circuit of the Americas, perfectly smooth at the time Grand Prix circuits, it just doesn't show the excitement of the supercar sport, but Singapore would capture that with its street circuit nature. So that's why I think supercars in Singapore work so well together. That place will bring out the things that make supercars special, really lean into it and showcase this amazing category to the world. As passionate as I am about this subject, this is all just my opinion though, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. This is the kind of subject that can really divide opinions, so please remember to be respectful and treat people like your trackside. And I will also link a poll where you can vote and let me know if you would like to see supercars in Singapore. Be sure to check out my other videos here on this relatively new channel, and when the season begins I will be doing plenty of supercars rounds previews, reviews and loads of discussion videos like this one in between.